I'm Ron Clements.
And I'm John Musker.
In our years with Walt Disney Feature Animation, we've been animators, producers, and directors. Having been through it all, we can tell you that probably the most difficult and time-consuming part of the process of making an animated film is getting the story right. The process of developing the story can take many years.
We try many different ideas in written treatments, visual concept art, and storyboards. Some stick, but a large number of those ideas get discarded along the way.
It was no different when Walt Disney was still around and running the studio. Many of his now classic animated films went through long periods of development before actual animation production. Peter Pan was no exception.
Walt had originally intended for Peter Pan to be his second animated film after Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which opened in 1937. Peter Pan did not actually make it to the screen until 1953, nearly 16 years later, in fact, the year that we were born.
We're here in the studio's animation research library where all the artwork for Disney's animated features is stored. Some of this material dates back to the late 1930s and early 1940s.
Today we are going to go back in time to take a look at some of those ideas. Ideas that were considered but ultimately rejected. So please join us now as we take a look at the Peter Pan that almost was.
Peter Pan began in 1904 as a stage play by J.M. Barrie, which is the story most of us are familiar with.
A lot of Walt Disney's effort in the early years was spent in trying to find the right balance between faithfully adapting Barrie's classic and exploring different ways to tell the story for the medium of animated film. For instance, in one of the greatest departures from Barrie's Peter Pan, instead of opening the story in the Darlings' nursery, Disney explored the possibility of starting the story in Neverland. This version establishes Tinkerbell's jealousy as she asks the mermaids if they've seen Peter Pan.
Well, hello, if it isn't little Miss Tinkerbell. What's bothering your pretty bells, my dear? Still ringing your bells for Peter Pan, eh?
Careful, Tink dear, you'll crack a chime. Funny thing, Peter Pan scarcely ever pays any attention to her.
Why should he? My, aren't we the jealous little pixie-wixie?
In this opening sequence, the Lost Boys play follow the leader and are captured by the Indians. Peter makes peace with the Indians.
Make Peter Pan big chief.
The Lost Boys are mad at Peter because if there's peace with the Indians, there's nothing for them to do. So they want to go to the real world like Peter does and hear mothers telling stories. Peter promises to kidnap a mother for them.
Walt eventually toned down the idea of kidnapping Wendy by returning to J.M. Barrie's stage play in which Wendy is eager to see Neverland.
Another radically different approach to the beginning of the story came from the earliest treatment in May 1939, which was based on Barrie's first Peter Pan book, Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. This version started with the birth of Peter Pan on Bird Island and told the story of how he flew from his nursery in London to return to his birthplace and how he came to live in Neverland and become the leader of the Lost Boys.
At a story meeting a few weeks later, Walt changed his mind, saying, "We ought to get right into the story itself, which is when Peter comes to the house to get his shadow. That's where the story picks up. How Peter came to be is really another story."
With this approach, the movie was to open in the Darlings' nursery.
Insolent boy, I'll slash you to ribbons!
And I'll cut you to pieces. Aha!
Over the next few years, Walt and his story team explored several different versions of the nursery scene.
Oh, don't lock it, Mother.
In the film, Wendy tells her mother she's keeping Peter Pan's shadow in the drawer.
Peter Pan. You see, I found something that belongs to him.
Oh? And what's that?
His shadow.
Shadow?
In one early version of the story, it was Mrs. Darling who sees Peter Pan outside the window of the children's nursery and captures his shadow. In the writer's own words,
The Darlings' nursemaid is a Newfoundland dog named Nana. She is every bit as efficient, however, as a human nursemaid and diligently goes about her duties, turning down the beds and laying out the children's nightclothes. Tonight, Mr. and Mrs. Darling are dining out, and Mrs. Darling enters the nursery dressed for the occasion. She is quite startled to see the face of a mysterious boy peering in at the window. Mr. Darling enters in a tantrum, struggling with his dress tie. Mrs. Darling's skillful fingers subdue the tie. Mr. Darling calms down, only to blow up again when he collides with Nana and gets his dress suit covered with dog hair.
Oh, Nana, for goodness sake!
When the children are out of earshot, Mrs. Darling tells her husband about the mysterious face at the window, recalling a visit from the strange boy a week ago. Mr. Darling is quite sure the whole affair is just so much foolish imagination. Until Mrs. Darling produces the shadow that the strange boy left behind after his first visit. It proves to be a very lively shadow, and Mrs. Darling barely has time to hide it again as the children return to the nursery, ready for bed.
What's cool about Peter Pan, of course, is the fantasy. And here, you know, they're standing on a cloud, sort of with a rainbow passing
Now that
through it.
has Nana on the cloud.
Nana, yeah, in this
so-
early version, or some version, they actually put Nana in Neverland with them, and that would have been interesting to see.
Another version suggested telling the entire story through the voiceover narration of Nana, the children's faithful nursemaid, as she accompanied the children to Neverland.
This idea was never fully realized, but these discussions probably helped develop the delightful character we know from the final film.
I'm so happy. I think I'll give you a kiss.
In the film, Wendy tries to give Peter Pan a kiss, but the jealous Tinkerbell destroys the moment by pulling Wendy's hair. In some earlier versions, Peter doesn't understand what a kiss is.
"Shall I give you a kiss?" she says. "Well, thank you," says Peter, holding out his hand expectantly. "Don't you know what a kiss is?" Wendy asks aghast. Well, not to hurt his feelings, she gives him a thimble. "Now," says Peter, "shall I give you a kiss?" "Oh, if you please," says Wendy primly, inclining her face toward him. Peter drops an acorn button into her hand, so Wendy says she will wear his kiss on a chain around her neck.
These are great. I mean, there's some wonderful drawings here, some of which I've never seen before. This is a really fun one of John playing with, I guess, a starfish character.
Yeah, in the early versions of the story, the one that wasn't released, John was actually left behind.
Up to Neverland!
In the film, Wendy, Michael, and John all fly away to Neverland with Peter Pan, leaving Nana at home. In some of the earlier versions, John was left behind for being too practical and serious. In the writer's own words,
"I'll go," says Wendy, "if my brothers can go too." Well, Peter inspects John's dream. It is dull and drab. John dreaming of himself as the image of his father. He's at a desk adding figures. "Oh, not him," says Peter disgustedly. Peter turns to Michael and looks at his dream. Michael is fighting an Indian with his right hand and grabbing a tiger by the tail with his left. "He'll do," says Peter.
And John was left out of the adventure until 1948, when writer Ralph Wright sent a memo to Walt suggesting to make John a strong character, a comic little replica of his dad. And John goes along only to protect Wendy on this dangerous experiment, though he tries to disprove everything. At the bottom of the memo, Walt wrote, "Good."
When there's a smile in your heart, there's no better time to start.
In the film, our first introduction to Neverland comes as Peter and Wendy and the boys arrive.
In an earlier version, our first glimpse of Neverland comes just before their arrival, in a sequence entitled The Vicious Circle. That established the Lost Boys, the Indians, and the pirates in a comical circular chase around the island.
For a time, Walt and his story team played with the idea that Wendy brought along her Peter Pan picture book to Neverland. In the writer's own words,
Wendy clutches the book as Peter recklessly exposes himself and the children to capture by taunting the pirates, who charge without hesitation. Pan quickly pushes the kids behind a huge leaf, leaving only their feet exposed. Smee fires a supercharged blunderbuss at point-blank range. The leaf is blasted to bits, leaving only a row of empty shoes. The children, unseen by the pirates, are safely perched on a limb overhead.
The book falls from the tree and into the hands of the pirates.
Back at the pirate ship, the pirates discover Hook's picture in the book. They are very much amused. Hook looks at the book and finds himself pictured. Smee takes a peek at the book and reads aloud, "The exact location of Peter Pan's secret hideout is..." He's interrupted by Hook, who yells, "Let me see that!" Smee obligingly tears the page out of the book and hands it to Hook. The page is caught by a gust of wind and is whisked through the porthole. A comic chase follows, ending with the page going over the side of the ship and landing in the water. The ever-present crocodile bites out the text, leaving only the margins.
For a time, Walt and his story team tried to fit in a sequence similar to a sequence that had been cut out of Snow White. Peter brings Wendy and her brothers to his hideout and treats his hungry guests to an imaginary dinner.
All ready for dinner, mates?
I want chocolate cake, strawberry.
Lemon pie, ice cream, and cake.
We'll eat hearty, mates.
They are seated at a table and Peter carves in pantomime an imaginary turkey.
What is this anyway? A game?
Business of boys eating invisible celery with sound effects, drinking soup, filling water glasses, etc. All in pantomime with sound effects. Nana's bewilderment when she is given a plate of food to eat. She tries to be polite and licks the invisible food, but does not believe Peter when he tells her that there is food on the plate.
Too bad you need real food to enjoy dinner. Make-believe is much more fun.
The imaginary dinner is followed by a real dinner, served by the fairies. As Walt said in one of the earliest story meetings, I think the fairies ought to wait on them. The fairies pick luscious things out of the trees and bring them to them. The fairies are sort of servants. To ordinary kids, fairies are something they dream about, but down here, you clap your hands and fairies appear. It's just ideal.
But unfortunately, as in Snow White, this charming scene was cut from Peter Pan as well.
And
there
this
was
is
a
great.
treasure, right? There was something with the treasure.
There's a treasure. There's some great drawings here of this cave filled with treasure that they're sort of silhouetted by these giant candles. Just great staging on this movie.
You'd better talk, me dear, for soon the tide will be in. Remember, there is no path through water to the happy hunting ground.
One of the first story treatments in 1939 contained a sequence from J.M. Barrie's play, the sequence on Skull Rock, in which Peter Pan rescues Tiger Lily, who has been kidnapped by Captain Hook.
But unlike the final film, in that version of the story, Peter and the others discover the pirate's treasure hidden in Skull Rock.
That's Skull Rock, where the pirates bury their treasure.
A later version of the storyboards shows them exploring Skull Rock and encountering the pirates' booby traps that guard the treasure.
Michael!
That version ended with Tiger Lily giving Peter Pan an Indian kiss, which Peter refers to as a thimble in Indian language.
Tinkerbell. Tink.
In the film,
Come here.
Tinkerbell is banished by Peter Pan for endangering Wendy when she first arrives in Neverland.
Tinkerbell.
I hereby banish you forever.
In earlier versions of the story, Tinkerbell suffered further humiliations that led to her ultimate betrayal of Peter Pan's hideout. One version begins with Smee telling Captain Hook that trouble is brewing between Peter Pan and Tinkerbell.
Did you say Pan has banished Tinkerbell?
That he is.
But why?
Well, on account of Wendy, Captain.
But this version goes beyond the film version when Smee informs Captain Hook that Peter is throwing a party for Wendy that very night.
And at that party, Wendy goes to find Tinkerbell, who's sulking in her room.
Tinkerbell, won't you come to the party? We're having so much fun.
Trying to cheer Tinkerbell up, Wendy takes off her ring and puts it on Tinkerbell's head like a crown.
Why, you look just like a little queen. That's it. You can be queen of the party.
But when Tinkerbell comes to the party, Peter proclaims Wendy as queen.
All hail, Queen Wendy!
In the film, Captain Hook's men capture Tinkerbell and bring her back to the pirate ship, where Hook tricks Tinkerbell into revealing the secret location of Peter Pan's hideout.
Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful.
But in a draft from 1941, Tinkerbell is so angry with Peter and Wendy that she goes of her own free will.
What's that, my dear? Well, well.
Your mother and mine.
In the film, Wendy sings a song about mothers to the lost boys that makes them sad. Even the pirates sneaking up on the hideout get nostalgic.
A few years earlier, Walt and his story team tried a version of the story in which the Lost Boys decide to go home with Wendy. Peter Pan draws a line in the sand telling them that once they go to the real world and grow up, they can never return. And Wendy gives Peter a piece of her mind.
And furthermore, Peter Pan, you're the most conceited, dishonest, deceitful person I've ever met. You never think of anyone but yourself. You're selfish, that's what you are.
In one early version, after Wendy makes the Lost Boys miss their mothers, Peter Pan tells the story of his own mother, how he flew out the window as a baby, and when he returned, he found the window locked and a new baby in his bed.
My mother had forgotten all about me. So you see, Wendy, you're wrong about mothers. They don't wait.
I want to go home before our window is closed.
In some very early versions of the story, as in Barry's play, when the Indians make peace with Peter Pan for saving Tiger Lily, they vow to guard Peter's hideout from the pirates.
And the Indians are guarding the hideout when the pirates attack.
Curly, twins, John, to your places! Quiet, everybody. If the Indians won, they'll beat the Tom-Toms. It's safe to go now. The boys will guide you through the woods.
In the film, Captain Hook leaves a package for Peter Pan, a bomb disguised as a present from Wendy.
And now to take care of Peter Pan.
But in the earliest versions of the story, Walt Disney and his story team took their cue from J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, knowing that Wendy, in her duties as the Lost Boys' mother, gave each of the boys medicine before bedtime.
Captain Hook put poison in Peter's dose.
Tinkerbell tries to warn him, but he doesn't believe her. And so she drinks the poison medicine before Peter can.
Pink! It was poison.
Peter begs Tinkerbell not to die, telling her she's the most important thing to him, and as in the J.M. Barrie stage production, asks the audience if they believe in everything Tinkerbell represents, to applaud for her to help keep her alive.
But after much discussion, Walt decided that the appeal for audience applause, which worked so well in the theater, would be difficult to pull off in a movie house. And this is from the sword fight between Peter Pan and Captain Hook, and Wooly Reitherman, again, one of the Nine Old Men, animated Captain Hook in this sequence. Great action animator, and it's just full of life, this whole sword fight.
Really broad, funny slapstick. You know, there were actually a lot of gags that never made it into the fight scene. The climactic fight between Peter Pan and Captain Hook was always part of the story. The development of the fight through storyboards concerned the gradual creation of specific gags within the fight,
including one whole sequence that showed Tinkerbell and the Pixies joining in the battle, temporarily turning the tide in their favor.
Even the beloved ending of the film went through many, many versions until Walt Disney was happy with the resolution of the story.
In one version, Peter Pan gives the lost boys the chance to go home.
In another, Nana is the only one who sees the pirate ship sailing off.
But in the end, Peter Pan flies Wendy and her brothers home and then returns to Neverland as the darlings watch from the window. Walt Disney was a perfectionist when it came to storytelling, and with his team of writers and artists, he worked tirelessly to craft each film, pushing the technology of animation and the art of storytelling beyond the limits of the films that came before.
The Peter Pan that almost was contained wonderful sequences, emotional moments, and the heart that made all his films timeless classics.
So you can be sure that the Peter Pan that is the story Walt wanted to tell.
You know, I have the strangest feeling that I've seen that ship before, a long time ago, when I was very young.